let us begin our financial modeling practice from revenue forecast, which is also sometimes called top-line forecast. Sales estimation, as I mentioned before, is one of the most important estimates that we will be making in our financial model. It makes the core basis for our three-statement model, and later on it is going to reflect heavily on our corporate valuations. So it's not only critical to operating expense estimates, but also it's going to be critical to capital expenditure estimates, depreciation estimates, R&D estimates. Just every single line item is going to be affected by revenue estimations. So in the end, how we estimate revenue is going to affect our enterprise value and later on our investment decision as well. So that is the reason why in many cases, consulting firms are hired to make only revenue estimates when there is a large acquisition deal. That is called commercial due diligence, and as I mentioned before, they're given 3 weeks, 4 weeks time, and all they're doing is just trying to get a perfect estimate on the revenue, perfect logic on the revenue. Of course, that is very difficult, but why they do that is because revenue is so important. Generally, there are two approaches to revenue forecast: the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. This is how every book, every material that is out there explains how to approach revenue forecast, and I definitely agree. So the top-down approach is approaching from the bigger view. So we're approaching from the market size, and we're going to multiply market share, and that's going to lead us to the company's revenue. So if you're using the top-down approach, and if we want to forecast 5 years of revenue, what we're trying to do is we're going to forecast 5 years of the market size, and then the 5 years of market share. That's going to get us to 5 years of revenue. That's the top-down approach. But on the bottom-up approach, we're building it from the bottom up. So eventually it's going to be a price times quantity formula. And here what we're trying to do is we're trying to forecast the quantity for the next 5 years, and then the price estimates for the next 5 years. That's going to get us to revenue. While both approaches has its merits and demerits, we use an approach considering what data we have available, what industry are we doing the modeling for, how many competitions, so how many players are in the market is very important to deciding which approach to use, because if you have, let's say, 100 competitors, players in the market, it's going to be very difficult to use a top-down approach. It's going to be very hard to assign a single market share, especially if the market is fragmented. Also, it's going to depend also on the storyline. So how you're going to represent your story is going to determine whether you use a top-down approach or bottom-up approach. Generally, we see bottom-up approaches much more often. I think more than 70% of the times we use bottom-up approaches simply because of these reasons. And one more important factor to using the bottom-up approach much more often is because it is so difficult to assume a single market share. So let's say that we're doing modeling for a Botox product. We can always estimate market size. Market size is not impossible to forecast. We can have our logics. We can say that in the next 5 years, market size is going to grow because more countries are going to be having access to Botox products, or maybe we can say that more men are now considering Botox injections. So if we split up the drivers for the market size, just the single drivers are not that difficult to forecast. But when it comes to market share, it's really unlogical to assign just a single number. So let's say that you're assigning 20% market share in year 5, and there's no actual reason behind that. Why not 19? Why not 21%? Those are the challenges to using the top-down approach. This market share assumption, just this single assumption, carries too much weight and thus make it very difficult. But some industry, for example, if you have the telecommunications industry, usually in each country there are not that many players. For example, in the US, maybe you have AT&T, you have T-Mobile. We just have a small few players, well, excluding the MVNOs. And plus the market share trends, it's not very fluctuant. It's quite stable, and you can get a sense of how it's going to move in the future. So in that case, maybe the top-down approach can be used, but in most cases, we use the bottom-up approach. If you have a lot of time, and maybe if it's a very important assumption, if you're doing a revenue forecast for an M&A, for example, you can do both. You can do both approaches and try to compare the results. Or what many people actually do is they just leave market share as a blank. They will, forecast markets for the next 5 years. They're going to forecast quantity and price for the next 5 years. And if we think that these two revenues should equal, we can calculate market share as a plug. And depending on the results, if the market share seems too high, like for example, if it's like 80% or something, and we think that it is ridiculously high, then we can make adjustments to our quantity and price assumptions, or maybe we can increase market size to decrease the implied market share. So that's how these two approaches normally work. In our course, in our Financial Modeling 101 course, we're going to use the bottom-up approach. But in our later contents, maybe on the top of my head, we have our pharma biotech modeling course, which uses mainly the top-down approach much more often. Or in our later case studies, there will be some models that use top-down approaches. But for now, let's focus on the bottom-up approach.